The mummy in the elevator shaft. The gleaming skyscrapers of modern Cairo reached into the sky, their glass and steel a sharp contrast to the dust and ruins of the ancient world beneath them. People bustled about in their daily lives, unaware of the dark secret that had been festering right beneath their feet, hidden in the creaking bones of the city's infrastructure. The name of the place had been forgotten over time, a once grand pyramid, now a crumbling ruin. It was there that the murderer had been entombed more than 3,000 years ago. He had been a scourge upon ancient Egypt, a man who killed with no remorse, no hesitation. His victims were found with their throats slit, their bodies mutilated in ways that suggested madness rather than just violence. For decades, he prowled the shadows, taking the lives of those who ventured too close to him. But even the darkest souls eventually meet their fate. When the killer was finally caught, the priests wanted something more than simple death for him. They wanted suffering, so they made him into something more than dead, a mummy, wrapped alive, his mouth sewn shut with coarse, black thread. His skin was treated with a sickening mixture of resin and salt, sealing his agony into eternity. For centuries, he remained sealed within his tomb, forgotten by time. That was, until the dig. The excavation of his tomb was supposed to be routine, a simple survey of artifacts. But when a group of archaeologists stumbled upon his sarcophagus, they made a grave mistake. They opened it. The moment the lid was cracked, a foul wind howled from within, and something ancient, something unspeakable, was set loose. The year was 2020. The mummy, still bound in rotting, foul-smelling linen, somehow found its way into the modern world. Confused and enraged, it wandered the streets of Cairo, disoriented by the lights, the noise, the people. Its flesh, shriveled and blackened, hung in tatters, dripping with a viscous, yellowish fluid that reeked of death. The killer was alive again, in a sense driven by a hunger that had been growing for thousands of years. And when it found the elevator shaft in an abandoned building, it knew it had found the perfect lair. The first disappearance was a small matter, a maintenance worker who'd gone down to inspect the building's faulty elevators. His wife thought he'd simply run off. People said that kind of thing happened all the time in Cairo, with its sprawling population. But when another worker disappeared, and then another, whispers began to spread. Still, no one thought to check the abandoned building. It was forgotten, just like the killer himself. Over the next 4 years, the mummy made the elevator shaft its home. It lurked in the shadows, hiding in the rusting gears and cables, waiting for anyone unfortunate enough to become trapped in the lift. When people got stuck, which happened more often than anyone liked to admit, they would hear it first, the heavy, wet sound of something moving in the darkness. Then, the terrible moaning, a low, guttural sound that rattled the very air, followed by a foul stench that hit the senses like a physical blow. The mummy's cries were deafening, a sound that echoed through the shafts like the wail of a dying animal. With each cry, a thick, dark fluid would pour from its ancient wounds, pooling on the floor beneath it. Those who were trapped in the elevator would bang on the doors, scream for help, but no one ever came in time. The mummy would emerge from the shadows, its twisted body reeking of rot, and it would feed. It ripped flesh from bone with jagged teeth and claw-like fingers, devouring its victims in a frenzy that left nothing behind. No bodies, no blood, just the silent, empty elevator. In 2024, the city was finally starting to take notice. People were vanishing without a trace. At first, it was only maintenance workers, but now ordinary citizens, tourists, businessmen were disappearing. And each time, they had one thing in common: they had last been seen entering the old building. Salim was a seasoned elevator technician, called in to fix a system that had long been plagued with issues. The building had a bad reputation, but work was work. He entered the rusty, groaning structure with a sinking feeling in his gut, the air inside thick with decay. The elevator shaft yawned open before him, and he could hear the faint sound of someone crying out below. He descended slowly, the ancient cables creaking under the strain. When the elevator stopped with a jolt, halfway between floors, Salim knew something was terribly wrong. The air grew colder, and the sickening smell of rot overwhelmed him. He tried to call for help, but the radio crackled with static. He was alone. Then he heard a sound like something scraping, something moving in the shadows. And then, that terrible moan. It was louder now, closer. Salim's heart pounded in his chest as he looked up and saw it. The mummy, its decayed face barely visible in the dim light. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed with a sickly yellow hue. As it opened its mouth, a thick, oozing fluid dripped from its rotten lips. Salim tried to move, but his body was frozen in terror. The mummy howled, a sound that vibrated through his bones, and it lunged toward him, its linen bandages unraveling as it crawled down the shaft. The last thing Salim saw was the mummy's face, inches from his own, before everything went black. Days passed, and when the police finally searched the building, they found no trace of Salim. The elevator doors opened to reveal nothing but an empty, silent shaft, and the cold, damp air smelled faintly of death. And so the legend of the mummy in the elevator shaft grew. People whispered about the building, about the disappearances, but no one dared to investigate too deeply. The ancient killer, wrapped in his rotting bandages, continued to lurk in the darkness, waiting for the next victim to stumble into his lair. And whenever the elevator groaned to a halt between floors, those who listened carefully could still hear the faint sound of crying, a low, mournful wail that echoed through the shafts, followed by the sickening sound of something wet, something terrible, moving in the shadows. And it was still hungry.